Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Daylight's third lesson. Okay, this is the third of six. I'm going to share what we're talking about today. Okay, so here we go. So today's journey of the soul. Today's all about grief. Grief, a fresh look at life, death, and peace. In peace. 1 second. So this is Journey of the Soul, lesson 3. See, we got a fancy PowerPoint here. Okay. So to start off for today, this is what we're going to be talking about. And just by way of introduction, so I'm going to share the book, the actual book. By the way, the actual book, I don't know how many of you bought it or didn't buy it. There was a link in the Google document to buy it, but I have it for now. I have it. Gosh, 1 second. I'm sorry. I've been doing this for a long time, and I still don't know what to share here and what not to share. Oh, there we go. Sorry. 1 second. There we go. Okay. So here's the actual book. Okay, so we're learning about grief. What is the Jewish way of grieving? You know, especially it's a very sensitive topic. It's a very sensitive time because it's been a year since COVID-19 started. I got to tell you that I'm a little down myself because Purim every year we have like a massive party. Purim is a huge event, and the last few weeks we started preparing Purim, and we're thinking maybe we'll be able to do a big event, maybe we'll be able to do something, but the reality is settling in that we're probably going to do a small Megillah reading, and that's it. I mean, there's nothing else we can do, so it is what it is. But Purim reminds me of COVID-19, the beginning, the onset of COVID-19, which began, and it is what it is. So this is just the first two sources we're going to read here is literally just an introduction to tonight's topic, and it's just to show you that no two people grieve the same way. We're going to get skills and tools, how to comfort others, how to go to pay a Shiva call. I can tell you that I grew up in South Africa, Johannesburg, and when I was a little child, I remember there was a little boy, 6 years old. On Friday night, he was walking out of shul with his father, and he kind of left his father, and a car came and ran him down, and he actually died. And I remember this person in my house 30 years later eating a Shabbat lunch. And I remember seeing him, and the pain that he felt 30 years later for his 6-year-old child was the same pain as if it happened yesterday. So the grief, the pain was still there 30 years later. Okay, so look at source number 1 here right in front of you. Resilience in the face of loss, text number 1. So this lady, Heather, was in the kitchen cleaning up after lunch when she heard, I'll make it a little bit bigger, when she heard a dull thud. It sounded as if it came from the hallway, and it was just a little too loud to ignore. Boys, she yelled, what are you up to? There was no answer. She found her 2 boys playing quietly on the couch in the living room. They giggled. You jokers, she said with a smile. What was that sound? They shrugged. Where's your father? Without waiting for an answer, she ran towards the hallway. She cried out in fear when she found her husband, John, writhing on the floor. John had severe asthma. He was taking a new medication, and it had seemed to be working, but suddenly had collapsed in the worst attack he'd ever had. Heather tried everything she could think of to save her husband's life. She called an ambulance. The rest was a blur. John died of cardiac arrest on the way to the hospital. Heather was 34 years old. Her boys were 5 and 7. At that moment, John's death felt like the worst thing that could have ever happened to her. Heather had lived her entire life in the same quiet suburban community in northern New Jersey. She and John had been high school sweethearts. They married. They purchased a home. They had children, a dog. Schools were good. Community was stable. And she thought television was more than it should be. But other than that, everything was fine. And then John died. She had to rethink it all. Now she was a single parent. She had to find new ways to earn money and also find extra time to be with her boys. And somehow she had to contain everyone's anguish. She found strength she didn't know she had. It was lonely and painful at times. Heather found meaning and vigor and even joy in the idea that she was going to make it. I expected to collapse. I really did. That's what I wanted to do. That would have been the easiest thing to do, Heather explained, but I couldn't. Each day I got up and did what I had to do. The days passed and somehow it was okay. The boys were great. They were upset in the beginning, of course. We all were. They hung in there and we stayed together. I loved those boys so much. John would have been proud of them. So this is just one reaction from a lady called Heather. And then another shorter one from a lady called Stephanie. Text number 2. In 2004, Stephanie Mulberg of Short Hills, New Jersey, lost her son, Eric, 13, to Ewing sarcoma, a bone cancer. 4 years after Eric's death, Mrs. Mulberg, now 48, walked around like a zombie. I felt guilty all the time. Guilty about living. She said I couldn't walk into the deli because Eric couldn't go there any longer. I couldn't play golf because Eric couldn't play golf. My life was a mess, and I couldn't talk to my friends about it because after a while, they didn't want to hear about it. Stephanie, you need your life back, they'd say. But how could I? On birthdays, I'd shut the door and take the phone off the hook. Eric couldn't have had any on my birthdays. Why should I? So you have over here, and this is by way of introduction for those just joining us now, it's just two people who had the loss of a loved one, but they reacted very, very, very differently. And as we'll see, no two people react the same. Every single person grieves for the loss of a loved one in his or her way, and it's just different. Okay? Okay. In other words, the truth is you can't really compare them, right? If you look and you analyze Stephanie versus Heather, you'll notice there's so many differences between them. First of all, Heather had 2 children. Everybody reacts differently. You can't judge anybody for their reaction. But tonight we'll discuss and we'll learn and we'll share the Torah's perspective on grieving, on mourning, the process, how to process it, how to bring it down, etc., etc. Okay, again, if there's any questions at any time during this whole thing, feel free to stop me. But otherwise, we will go on, and I will continue sharing the screen. Okay. So this is the introduction that we are now. Why do people react so differently? The answer is no two people are alike. No two circumstances are the same. And today, one of the things we're going to learn is how can one experiencing grief re-emerge into life? One of the most painful things there is, if not the most painful, is the loss of a loved one. So after the loss of a loved one, how do you re-emerge back into life? Is there such a thing as life afterwards? So what we're going to learn tonight, and this is the lesson overview in front of you on the screen, the Torah view of mourning and grief, Torah principles for dealing with chronic grief, and the etiquette when visiting the grieving. How is the grieving person supposed to respond? But more importantly, for that part of the lesson is, what are you supposed to do? How are you supposed to feel comfortable going to a Shiva house? So these are things, this is the lesson overview for tonight. Okay, so I personally don't like this part of the lesson, but I mean, it is what it is. Socrates, we have to learn it. So Socrates, so let's just look briefly at what Socrates says over here. It's next text. Sorry, right in front of you. Right over here. So they just brought over here, this JLI, brought that Socrates, a philosopher's basically saying, you could read the text, but he says that, you know, death is not something that we should grieve, not something that we should mourn for. You know, Socrates was arrested and he was put to death for something, and he was given a way of escaping, and he said, I'm not going to escape, because if death is decreed upon me, it's decreed upon me, that's what's going to happen. So in the text right in front of you, then he or any man who has the spirit of philosophy will be willing to die, but he will not take his own life, for that is held to be unlawful. This is just Socrates' approach, and it's right over here, if you can see it as well. He's not permitted to be his own benefactor, but must wait for the hand of another. What does the Torah view on this? Here's source number 1, really. You haven't been paying attention till now. Here's where the class starts, okay? Text number 4. The Torah says, this is from Maimonides, Mitzvat aseli tabel el akrovim. We are biblically commanded to mourn the deaths of our next of kin. That means like this. Just like there's a mitzvah to put on tefillin, there's a mitzvah to light Shabbat candles, there's a mitzvah to give charity. There's 613 mitzvot. One of those 613 mitzvot is to mourn the deaths of our next of kin. By the way, many of these 613 mitzvot are not applicable today because we don't have the temple. But even the ones that are applicable are not applicable at all times. For example, if thank God you don't have the loss of a death of a loved one yet, you don't have to fulfill the mitzvah. So there's only really like 89 mitzvot which are actually able to be fulfilled by all Jews at all times. And out of those 89, many of them are negative commandments. Some of them are positive. So the positive commandments are very little. That's just a by the way. Okay, so text number 5a. How do we mourn? How do we grieve? What do we need to do? The Torah does not forbid us to weep in response to a death, because it is human nature to be moved to tears when separating from loved ones and that they're journeying away, even if they are alive. So, whereas Socrates and the philosophy say, oh, we don't need to mourn, whatever, Jewish way is that we mourn. It's a mitzvah to mourn. And not only that, the Ramban Nachmanides in the source we just read is that Torah doesn't forbid us to weep, but it's human nature to cry. And if you look at so many of our biblical scholars, Jacob, it says he mourned and he cried for the loss of Joseph for 22 years. He cried for the loss of Joseph. By the way, the Torah kind of puts the reason why Jacob felt the pain for 22 years is because Joseph was still alive. But it says that God decrees that after a year or so, the pain is less severe. It's still there. It will never go away, but it's a little bit less severe after that year. But the reason why Jacob cried for 22 years is because Joseph was still alive and he felt it. His body felt it. And in text number 5, we take this even a little further. Not only could we cry, but we should cry. Text number 5b, Maimonides, the Rambam writes, mourners find comfort in crying and in arousing their sorrow until their bodies are too weak to handle the intensity of their internal turmoil, just as happy individuals find contentment in various forms of light-hearted activities, right? Just like somebody who's happy wants to do happy things, somebody who's mourning wants to cry. It's a way of processing. It's a way of expressing your sorrow. It says that a grown man is actually a sign of strength, is that he cries, he or she cry. It's not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength. So in text number 5a, what we saw was, if you look at this carefully again, 5a, we said that the Torah doesn't forbid crying. Text number 5b, it says that we actually find comfort in crying. But text number 5c takes this even further, is that if you don't cry, there's look at text 5c. Question. One of this is from the Rabbi, the book you have in front of you. One of this generation's greatest personalities failed to shed a single tear upon losing a son. Is this praiseworthy reaction? So this is a question that was posed to the Rabbi David ibn Zimra. Okay, so such behavior, he answers, is offensive and objectionable. It demonstrates heartlessness, distasteful character, and cruelty. This is the way of the philosophers who maintain that this world is without purpose. By the way, we're not talking here about somebody who doesn't cry because they're emotionally paralyzed, like in an emotional freeze. There are some people like that. We're talking about somebody who's not crying because he thinks tears are unwarranted. So by contrast, we who have received the Torah are expected to believe and to realize that this world is of great value for those who properly utilize their time here and behave appropriately. It is through our actions in this world that we merit the world to come. See, what happens is like this. Let me just explain this. What happens is, when you look at crying, at mourning, why do we mourn? Didn't we learn last week that this world, this world is like a corridor, and the Olam Haba, paradise, is a real world? Didn't we learn that the soul itself is actually finally released from the shackles of the body? The soul goes to heaven and soars and enjoys the divine delicacies. So why is that sad? The reason why it's sad is because we learned last week, the end of last week, Rabbi Chia was crying before the end of his life because the soul can accomplish so much here in this world, but also for the people that you leave behind. Crying, mourning, and shedding tears over the passing of a relative, and especially for an honorable individual, is the way of the pious, the prophets, and individuals renowned for their good deeds. It is not for naught that our sages instructs us to observe 3 days for weeping. Right, we'll learn this in a second more in detail, but 3 days for weeping, 7 for eulogies, 30 for restrictions, and wearing new clothing, getting haircuts, and then the full year. If weeping were improper, the sages would not have instituted a 3-day weeping period. In fact, the Torah emphasizes that our forefather Abraham came came to utilize Sarah and weep for her. Right when Sarah was buried and Abraham bought her a grave, he cried. And that Jacob, King David, and countless individuals of similar caliber acted likewise. Stop here for a second just to see if anybody has any questions. And if there's any questions at any time, please feel free to stop me. Okay, so back. Okay, so the Torah view on mourning. Number one, acknowledgement of reality. Number two, as we'll see in a moment, there's tremendous psychological benefits. And number three, the value of physical life. You see, that's why we mourn, because we value and appreciate the physical life. We know how important it is to live in this world. We know how much the soul can accomplish, how many mitzvot the soul can accomplish in this world. Right? The Torah philosophy is the purpose of all creation is this physical world and God's desire that we serve him. Right? If somebody comes with a gun to his head and says, "I'm going to kill you if you don't do this sin," you'd rather do the sin than die, right? Unless it's the three cardinal sins. Why is that? Because God wants us to live. He wants us to live. We can accomplish so much in this world when we are alive. So any time, any second that God gives us life, we need to cherish it. But on the other hand, and that's why we mourn and we cry for the soul when it passes away. Okay, and look at the screen at the figure number 3.1. So first of all, the Torah rules of mourning are limited to the following next of kin. You only mourn for a father, mother, sibling, spouse, son or daughter. Now, I get this question once in a while, and I'm going to ask it to you guys. What do you think of mourning for an estranged blood relative? So somebody who hasn't spoken to his or her father for many, many years, do you still mourn for them? What about a brother you haven't spoken to in 40 years? What about a child you haven't spoken to in a long, long time, estranged? What about an estranged spouse? What about a spouse that you don't like? An abused spouse, do you mourn for them? You don't mourn for them? So the answer is, just briefly, the laws of mourning apply even to somebody who's estranged, and as long as it's a blood relative. If it's a couple, a spouse, for example, and they already agreed to a divorce or the relationship is abusive, that the spouse doesn't feel like he or she needs to grieve, so the laws of mourning don't necessarily apply. Okay, but back to that figure right over here. So father, mother, sibling, spouse, son, daughter, these are the people the Torah defines that we mourn for. Now, the level number one in mourning. Look at figure 3.2. It's called aninut, an onen. Onen is the most intense period of mourning. An onen, if you can read that screen, I think you should be able to read it. It's the time from the time of death until the actual funeral. So it takes sometimes a day. By the way, the Jewish custom is to bury as soon as possible, right away. In Jerusalem, they literally, Israel, they're crazy about this. They literally bury within hours. Even if the person passes away at 2 p.m., within 2 hours they'll bury. But the time from the moment of passing until the interment, that's called onen. And onen is absolved from any mitzvah. He doesn't have to say Shema, he doesn't have to put on tefillin. He or she don't have to observe any commandment because they are in a time of aninut, which is mourning. And that's level number one. Level number two is the Shiva, which is a 7-day period. Then the Shloshim, which is a 30-day period, which basically means after getting up from the Shiva and you don't have those restrictions, but you now have the restrictions of haircut, shaving, and all that. And then there's a 12 months, and then obviously there's the yard site. Right? So those are the levels. Okay. So what we need to discuss now is how do we process the pain, but I just want to show you this. Okay, time for aninut, you have the laws over here. Okay, no attempt to console mourners. When somebody's on onen, there's no Shiva. You don't visit him or her. Absolved from mitzvot, right? Immediate family members tear part of the outer garments, which we'll discuss in a minute. Shloshim. So just the chart over here shows it to you very, very clearly. What are the laws? You avoid new clothes, no haircuts, no festive events. 12-month mourning. The laws are this period applies to one mourning a parent, right? Because if it's a sibling, it's different laws. We avoid weddings, right? And customarily keep the candle burning for the entire 12 months. Look at that bottom one. The custom is to keep a candle burning for the entire 12 months. And then obviously you have the Yortzeit, where you have the recitation of Kaddish, extra Torah study, you can sponsor a Kiddush, do some good deed in memory and merit of the deceased. Okay. Back to the book over here. Again, anytime anybody has questions, please stop me. This part over here, I'm going to actually leave out. This is, if anybody, the psychologist, a psychiatrist here needs the credits for the course. It's basically a psychiatry thing. I mean, there's 2-track model of bereavement. It's optional in this course here. I'm going to actually skip it out. But if anybody wants to look at it afterwards, I'll be more than happy. But we're going to go with text number 6. Right in front of you.
Yes. This is Michael. I'm not sure if the chats are working, but question I had was, since you indicated earlier, other sessions, that Jews believe in reincarnation, I'm not highly observant, so I don't believe that concept is ever recognized formally during the mourning process, and I'm wondering why it is not as it would be a source of comfort to the bereft or the grieving.
Okay, so first of all, I just want to mention there's a whole lesson number 5 is dedicated to reincarnation. The entire lesson from beginning to end is only about reincarnation. I'm going to come to reincarnation briefly just at the end of this lesson. Towards the end, 3/4 in, I'm going to mention a nice, beautiful story about reincarnation, which should provide a source of comfort, which should answer your question.
Thank you.
And I'm going to be checking the chat now as well, so I'm sorry I missed that question. Okay. Okay. The text number 6. This is talking about Jacob and Joseph. So when Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery, they said they dipped his coat in blood. And look at the text in front of you. The brothers slaughtered a goat and dipped Joseph's tunic, his coat, in its blood. They sent the colored coat home, and the couriers brought it to their father. It was Yehuda, by the way, and said, "We have found this. Please identify whether or not it is your son's coat." Jacob recognized it and exclaimed, "It is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph has been torn to pieces." Jacob rent his garments. Okay, look, pay attention to what Jacob did now that he thinks his child has died. He tore his garments, placed sackcloth on his loins, and mourned his son for many days. Okay, so let's just analyze this a second. So we want to talk now specifically about tearing one's clothes. Now, the halacha, the custom is, and I'm not going to get to if it's the right-hand side or the left-hand side, but you're actually supposed to tear your clothing. I know now, in Manhattan, there's this brief little ribbon which they cut. I mean, it's not the ideal thing. The ideal thing is to actually cut your garments. I remember when my father had to tear his garments for his mother. He had a new suit. He had bought a new suit, and his mother had passed away. And I remember him saying something like, the new suit, I know it's expensive and it's a brand new suit, but my mother was worth more than that, And he actually tore that garment, which he wore the whole entire Shiva. But why do we tear the garment? What is the act of tearing a garment, especially in front of a crowd? Because you're supposed to do it in public pretty much. So it's an expression of pain and sorrow. That's what it is. It counteracts the common response of denial by basically supplying a tangible and inescapable physical expression of the loss. So the initial thing is denial, right? That's what we're in denial. But what tearing does is enables you to mourn publicly. And look at text number 7. Rabbi Yaakov Chagit states that mourners are instructed to rend their garments as a method of distracting from and reducing the overwhelming grief. In my humble opinion, the opposite is true. Having to rend the garments brings mourners to tears and amplifies their pain. The goal is to actively encourage mourners to express their pain over the passing and to experience their tremendous loss. So you want mourners to process the pain, to begin the process. And instead of distracting and reducing the overwhelming grief, no, we want them to grieve. We want them to cry. We want mourners to tear their garments. So if you look at that thing on the right-hand side, the Finding Comfort, the Jewish way of mourning is designed to induce a gradual but progressive emergence into normal society and function. So, by the way, in general, just taking time to mourn, taking time to grieve, is critical for the healing process. You can't just suddenly go back to work and forget about everything. No, the Shiva is designed to focus and to spend time at home and to mourn and you know, to process it. And tearing is the first sign which basically triggers this process. Okay, so the Jewish mourning process addresses both perspectives: engagement at work, maintaining relationships and other interests, connection with the deceased, separation from the deceased. We'll discuss this more in a moment. Okay, but you see the screen. Psychological benefits of carrying the garment is acceptance, and the Shiva, the 7 days, is processing. It's accepting what happened and processing. Okay, let's get back to this. Okay. Text number 8. This is straight from the Talmud. The Talmud says, neither cry for the dead nor bemoan him. Neither cry for the dead more than necessary, nor bemoan him more than what is prescribed. So the Jewish process is yes, you need to cry, and you need to grieve, and you need to tear your garments, and you need to say Shiva, and you need to say Kaddish for a whole year, but you shouldn't cry for the dead more than is necessary. You shouldn't mourn too much, basically. So what is the prescribed method, says the Talmud? How we expect it to act? 3 days for weeping. The first 3 days, I think we learned this last week as well, are more for the soul, right? The soul is like more presence. The first 3 days are literally for crying. The 7 days for eulogies, that's the Shiva, the 7 days of Shiva. And then 30 days, which is the Shloshim, is for restrictions on new clothing and haircuts. And once these have lapsed, God declares, you are not more compassionate than I. What this means is like this. Obviously, every single person grieved and mourned in his or her way, in their own method. And we don't know, like I said in the beginning of the class, I know a person from my father's community who mourned and was grieving and was in pain 30 years after his son passed away. So there's no two ways. But the Jewish way, God puts it in 3 days, 7 days, 30, and then the full year, basically. But what the Talmud's trying to say is that extended mourning is not what God wants from us. And how we to find comfort and move on is going to be the next source. Okay, but okay, and this is what the Talmud we just read writes, you are not more compassionate than I. But how do we find comfort and how do we move on? It's very, very difficult. So here we come to the prayer which the Ashkenazim say to somebody who's mourning. By the way, in the Sephardic circles, the Sephardic say, I know we have Sephardim on the call today, the Sephardim say, Min hashamayim tenuchamu. From heaven you should be comforted. That's the Sephardic way of reciting a prayer, so to speak, to the mourner. But the Ashkenazim recite this following verse. Now, the letter that we're going to read, just by way of introduction, Ariel Sharon, who we all know, who founded Unit 101, was eventually the Prime Minister of Israel, probably the greatest soldier, the greatest general. He had a son. He had a son whose name was Gur. And Gur was playing with another one of his sons. And, you know, Ariel Sharon had the guns in the house. No, so I know this gets into the gun situation in America. Yes, guns, no guns. But Ariel Sharon had guns, and his two children were playing with shotguns, literally. And one of the kids, or Gur himself, shot himself. He was a 7, 8, 9-year-old. He shot himself in the head, and he basically died in Ariel's hands. And this Ariel Sharon Arik was inconsolable, right? This is the guy who saved Israel during the Yom Kippur War by doing this daredevil tactic, by going over the Suez Canal and entrapping the Egyptian Third Army. This is the guy in 1967, made miracles. Arik Sharon was inconsolable, and he wrote a letter to the Lubavitcher Rebbe in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, Chabad headquarters, and the Rebbe wrote him a letter back. I always quote this letter because it's very powerful. We're going to read one excerpt of this letter. It's a long letter, but it's based on this verse, which is the traditional greeting we say to Ashkenazim. So when you come to a mourner's house, you say, "May Hashem comfort you with all other mourners of Zion and Jerusalem." So the Rebbe's like, "What? Like, why do we say that? Like, what? Maybe say a different verse, like, may God comfort you with all other mourners of Zion and Jerusalem." So let's think from the mourner's perspective a second. Like, okay, what am I supposed to think? May God comfort me like all other mourners of Zion? So the Rebbe writes the letter like this. Look at it. In regard to Zion and Jerusalem, the Romans, and before them the Babylonians, were given dominion only over the wood and stone, silver and gold of the temple's physical manifestation. So the Romans, the Babylonians, they destroyed, they annihilated, they plundered the wood and the stone, they burned the temple to the ground. But what they did not burn, but not over its inner spiritual essence contained within the heart of each and every Jew. There's a song which goes, I will build God a sanctuary in my heart. The sanctuary, the edifice, the temple is alive and well inside the heart of every single Jew. The Romans may have destroyed the external structure, but the internal thing exists in every single Jew. Over this, the nations have no dominion, and it stands eternally. So too, regarding the mourning of the individual, death dominates only the physical body and concerns of the deceased person. The soul, however, is eternal. It is merely ascended to the world of truth. So what we say, what Ariel Sharon was told by the Rebbe, is that yes, the external gur was taken away. Your son, your beloved and treasured son, was taken away, but his soul is eternal. And this is the idea that we've been learning also in the last few weeks, that the soul is eternal, the soul lives on, and that is the source of comfort. And that is what we actually tell a mourner. May God comfort you with all other mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. And to go back just, Michael, to your question about reincarnation, the other thing that the Rebbe brings over here is that just like Zion will be rebuilt, right? We pray about 25 times a day. May we merit the rebuilding of the temple, right? The Sfardim even say, the Ashkenazim say the 13 principles of faith every day. We probably say it multiple times a day, a prayer for Mashiach. We know that the temple will be rebuilt. So we're telling the mourner that just like the temple will be rebuilt, don't worry, your child, your loved one will come back, right? Because we believe in Tchiyat HaMetim, resurrection of the dead. I'm sorry, Mike, not reincarnation, resurrection of the dead was this thing. Reincarnation we'll get to later on. This is resurrection of the dead. Okay, so that's one point which the Rebbe mentioned over here in that letter to Ariel Sharon. Okay, 1 second. So over here, you have it here. Okay, Hamakom Yenachem Etchem. The other thing is, Hamakom is God. The ability to find comfort comes from God himself. Right? Who can comfort you? Hashem, God. And this is just what we just learned. Zion is a physical absence, spiritual immortality. Physical destruction, spiritual indestructibility. That is death. Same as Zion and death. So you have it just in the screen in front of you. Okay, so let's just watch this video a second. 1 second.
Rabbi?
Yes.
I just noticed it's interesting that you use the name Hamakom instead of all the other names of God. You use the name Hamakom. Hamakom translates to space. Does that also play on God's physical presence versus, his spiritual presence?
It's interesting. The Rebbe mentions this hamakom, and he says basically hamakom. This comfort comes from the level of God that is connected to olamot, and relating to the pain of the avel. There's also a gematria, by the way, about hamakom. But you're talking about specifically something which is space.
Well,
right?
I'm saying that it's interesting that it's interesting that the only one of the few times I can think of God's name as being referenced as hamakom is when you're talking about physical space, and it's used in a time when you're comforting people who are going from the physical world to the world of the spiritual world in Judaism, or based on what you're articulating. So you can't miss the irony or the parallel to what you're sort of outlining here, which is God, you're giving comfort, saying people, you will be, your spirit continues to stay here, and then you're using God's physical manifestation when we typically think of him as a spiritual manifestation.
Right. Correct. Yeah. No. 100%. 100%. It is what it is. Yeah. That is what it is. Yes. Okay. So check out this video here. Here we go.
When a loved one passes away, Jewish law calls upon the immediate family to experience the rite of Shiva. Approximately 7 days are spent in mourning and receiving comfort from visitors. A doctor, a rabbi, and an acclaimed lecturer offer personal reflections on the rite of Shiva.
When someone dies, the relationship with the deceased doesn't end. The relationship with the person who died continues. It changes from place to place, interpersonal relationship to a relationship of memories to a relationship of legacies. By engaging the mourners in this process, you're helping them make that shift.
The purpose of Shiva is meant for the mourner to be able to take that time aside from the affairs of life and affairs of the world, to contemplate, to introspect, and to share with others the life they had, with the person they loved. People come to visit and console and try to bring comfort to the mourner.
Structure of it and the formality of it gives a sense of relief. When you're grieving, it's very all over the place, very hard to contain. And the structure of the Shiva brings a relief and a sense of conformity, which is quite redeeming.
If you want to help comfort the griever, what you're in essence doing by taking an interest in the person who's died is helping that person preserve his life.
I remember hearing people say things to me that was almost like they said it and the words stopped right here. But days and weeks and months later, they slowly made their way in.
The point of the Shiva is not to come up with anything brilliantly comforting to say, because there really isn't anything to say. Rather, it's just simply to be there.
One person who lost a toddler under very, very tragic circumstances told me what was the most comforting visit all week. And I'll say it the way he said it. He said an older gentleman with a lot of life experience came in. He said he sat in front of him and he asked to see a picture of his daughter. He gave him the picture. He looked at the picture. He cried for 10 minutes straight. He gave the picture back. He said the traditional verse that you say as you leave, and that was it. And he said that was, without a doubt, the most comforting visit.
But in retrospect, I have to say that week of the passage between one reality and the next reality, somehow I have to believe in His infinite wisdom, God saw to it that this passage not be taken alone, even while feeling lonely.
Take on a mitzvah. Do something, and it can be tiny, but I'm going to do it in memory of this person, and especially if it fits with that person. That's comforting. Now the world's a slightly better place because of that person.
Okay. Second. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So this is what we're learning now, right? Sion, physical absence, we got this already. Soul never dies. Okay. So back over here, this is the book we have in front of us. This is we're now holding text number 10, okay, on the left-hand side. This is from Rabbi Moss. Often within their pain, the mourners have an underlying belief that it isn't true, that their loved one hasn't really gone. This is not just denial. In a way, they are right. Death is not an absolute reality. Our souls existed before we were born, and they continue to exist after we die. Souls that have passed on are still with us. We can't see them, but we sense they are there. We can't hear them, but we know that they hear us. On the surface, we're apart. Beyond the surface, nothing can separate us. So we tear our garments. This has a dual symbolism. Number one, we recognize the loss, that our hearts are torn, but ultimately, the body is also only a garment that the soul wears. Death is when we strip off one uniform and take on another. The garment may be torn, but the essence of the person within it is still intact. So you're tearing on the one hand, your heart is torn, but the essence of the person is still there. From our worldly perspective, death is indeed a tragedy, and the sorrow experienced by the mourners is real. But as they tear their garments, we hope that within the pain, they can sense a glimmer of a deep truth. The soul never dies. Okay? And there's another video here I want to show you, but before we do that, the issue is, okay, one second, let me just show you this one second. One more video here, which discusses this exact topic before we move on. Right over here. Okay, bear with me for a minute while I'll show you this video.
Today's reflection is going to involve an image which all of us probably have an immediate and strong reaction to. It is an icon for Jewish people all over the world and throughout the ages. An image that when we see it, we have a very strong and almost reflex response. I'm speaking of the image of the Western Wall, the only remaining vestige of the once glorious Holy Temple which stood in Jerusalem and was destroyed 2,000 years ago. We're going to use this image to help us in relating to our understanding of our relationship with those who have passed on. So imagine, if you will, in your mind's eye, the image of the temple, the glorious temple as it stood, as it was built by Solomon in its royal splendor, something that was revered by peoples all over the world. And now, juxtapose that glorious image with the image of the Western Wall as it stands now and has stood for 2,000 years in its destroyed state. Go back and forth between these two images. The temple as it stood in its glory, and the temple in ruins when we only have the Western Wall. The Western Wall is a symbol of destruction. The temple is no more. And yet, think about the hope, the strength, the inspiration, the spiritual and emotional energy that emanates from that image, even when the temple is in its destroyed state. Now think about a loved one who has passed on. Think about them when they were here with us in the physical world. Think about the situation at present when their physical body is no more. Are they really gone? Have they really lost their influence and power in your life? Or are they like the Western Wall? The Western Wall is an image of destruction, and yet the Western Wall is a symbol of inspiration and hope, pride, powerful, powerful emotions. Think of this image. Think of the feelings that it evokes in you. And now relate this as a symbol to those who are currently, physically, their vessel has been destroyed. But spiritually, their power is as great as ever. We'll take a moment now to reflect and to connect to this image and to relate it to our loved ones.
Okay. I just want to stop for a second. Any questions so far? Okay. So one thing we haven't dealt with yet, I mean, somebody who's stuck in grief, again, like we learned in the beginning of the class, there's so many different reactions. There was Stephanie and there was Heather, I think, different reactions, and we can't blame anybody, and everybody reacts and grieves and mourns differently. But one of the things is anger and injustice. Like, for example, why? Why did this person suffer? Why did this person have to die? Especially if it's a person who dies in the prime of his or her life. They die early. Like, it's the injustice. An old person versus a young person dying is also, the pain is so wrought and strong. I think one of the most powerful sources for this is the next source we're going to read from one of the greatest men in history, Rabbi Yochram ben Zakai. So let's just a brief background of Rabbi Yochram ben Zakai. Rabbi Yochram ben Zakai was a person who witnessed millions of Jews go into exile. He witnessed the destruction of the temple. Hey, Rabbi Yochram ben Zakai witnessed the destruction of the temple. The Romans came and destroyed the temple. He was a towering figure. He gave so much consolation and comfort to other people. And yet we find that when his child died, he was inconsolable. This great man, this legend, the leader of the Jewish people, the leader of the entire Jewish people, who comforted and watched millions of Jews go into exile, sold as slaves, hundreds of thousands of Jews butchered in front of his eyes. They died, right? It was a Holocaust. But this person, when his young son died, he was inconsolable, and his students came to console him. And let's see what happens over here. This is perhaps the nicest, deepest source that we're going to learn tonight. Okay, so text number 11. That's the Hebrew. I'm sorry. Those of you who read Hebrew, that's great. But for those who read Hebrew and English, here we go. So when the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai passed away, his students arrived to console him. By the way, Rabbi Yochanan, it says in Pirkei Avot, he had 5 towering, leading students. So each of these students came to console him. Rabbi Eliezer entered and sat before him. Right? He was come to pay a Shiva call. Master, he said, would you like me to share thoughts? Speak, he responded. So Rabbi Eliezer said, Adam had a son who died. Right? When Cain killed Hevel, Adam was singing Shiva for his son. And he allowed himself to be consoled. How do we know that he accepted consolation? For it is stated, Adam was again intimate with his wife. By the way, Adam was intimate with his wife. It took him, after Cain and Hevel, it took him 130 years, by the way, too. It was the longest argument. They had an argument about the apple, about the Garden of Eden. So, but again, he resolved this thing, and he had another child. So you should also allow yourself to be consoled. Rabbi Yochanan retorted, is it not enough that I'm grieving my own loss, that you have to make me feel pain for Adam as well? Like, why you come to tell me, oh, somebody else also lost a child and he was able to be comforted? Not only have you not consoled me, you made it much worse. You made it double the pain, because now I feel the pain of Adam as well. So his next student came. Rabbi Yeshua entered and asked, would you like me to share thoughts? Speak, he responded. Rabbi Yeshua said, Job, which is Eov. Eov had sons and daughters, and they all died in a single day, yet he allowed himself to be consoled. By the way, Eov was a person who suffered the greatest suffering. The greatest suffering that a man can ever suffer was Eov, Job. So you should also accept consolation. How do we know the job was consoled for? He declared, God has given and God has taken. May God's name be blessed. By the way, this is a very, very famous thing. Hashem natan, Hashem lakach, Yishem Hashem bevoach, matav olam. God has given, God has taken. Rabbi Yochanan retorted, is it not enough that I'm grieving my own loss, that you have to make me feel pain for job as well? Same idea. So his third student entered. Rabbi Yosef entered and sat before him. Master, he said, would you like me to share a thought? You speak, he responded. Rabbi Yosef said, Aaron, right, Moses' brother Aaron, had 2 illustrious sons, but they both died in a single day. And yet he allowed himself to be consoled. As it is stated, Aaron kept silent. By the way, Aaron was by Yidom Aharon. He had no words. He was just quiet after he lost his 2 beloved children. His silence implied that he was without grievance and accepted consolation. So you should also allow yourself to be consoled. Rabbi Yochanan retorted, is it not enough that I'm grieving my own loss, that you have to make me feel pain for Aaron as well? Fourth guy enters. Rabbi Shimon, he says, would you like me to share a thought? Yes. Rabbi Shimon said, King David had a son who died. Right? King David, when he sinned with Bathsheba, there were 4 children that he lost. But this child over here is the one that he lost with Bathsheba before King Solomon was born. So he lost a son. King David had a son who died. He allowed himself to be consoled, and you should allow yourself to be consoled as well. How do we know that King David was consoled? For it stated, David comforted Bathsheba, his wife, and he was intimate with her, and she bore a son, and he called his name Solomon. It says in the beginning, by the way, David was inconsolable for weeks and weeks and weeks. He was crying on the floor. But eventually he was comforted, and he had a child, Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech. So should you, master, allow yourself to be consoled? Rabbi Yochanan told us, it's not enough that I'm grieving my own loss, you should make me feel bad for King David as well. Finally, the 5th student, and here is how Rabbi Yochanan was finally able to be comforted. Rabbi Elazar ben Arach entered. When Rabbi Yochanan saw him, he told his attendant, grab a set of clothing for me and be prepared to follow me to the bathhouse. For Rabbi Elazar is a great person, and I will not be able to hold out in the face of his comforting words. Rabbi Elazar was the greatest of the 5 students, so that's why Rabbi Yochanan anticipated that he'd be able to be comforted. But here's what he said. Rabbi Elazar entered, sat before Rabbi Yochanan and told him, let me share a parable. Your situation is similar to that of an individual to whom the king entrusted an article for safekeeping. Imagine you have a king who gives you something to guard. Each day, the man would weep and wail in fear. Woe is to me, when will I emerge unharmed from the safekeeping role? You, master, also had a son. He was fluent in the Torah, the prophets, and the scriptures, and the Mishnah, the Halakha, and the teachings, and he passed from this world without sin. You should certainly accept consolation, for you have returned your deposit in perfect condition. Rabbi Yochanan responded, Rabbi Elazar, my son, you have comforted me in a most humane fashion. So the question is, why did Rabbi Yochanan fail to be comforted by all the previous 4 visitors, and what was the message of Rabbi Elazar ben Arach which enabled him to be comforted? By the way, Rabbi Yochanan's message to his first 4 students was, every person is different. The fact that King David and the fact that all the Adam was able to be comforted doesn't mean I'm able to be comforted, because every single one of us is different. We're not the same. So, by the way, that's just a powerful lesson in itself. Like, every person responds differently. Some people grieve more, some people grieve less. The heart cannot receive command, right? You can't tell my heart, oh, feel pain, feel less pain, feel more pain. My heart is my heart, and it responds the way it is. But Rabbi Elazar ben Arach's message was a personal message. How did he succeed? 2 points. 2 points, which I think are on the screen in front of you, right over here. Yeah, right. Over here. Okay, this is, by the way, what we learn. How can the Torah help a person who is stuck? Some people are stuck because of the injustice, the guilt, depression, sadness, anger, denial. So how can Torah help you move on from this? This is the exact point we're discussing. Rabbi Yochanan was a young child who passed away. Where the injustice, right? Guilt, depression, he had all these feelings. But this is what he told him. For you have returned your deposit in perfect condition. Right? Rabbi Elazar acknowledged that everyone is different, and he offered a path to comfort. What was that? Here's the 2 points that he mentioned. Number 1, life is a deposit. Rabbi Elazar said, Our lives were given to us as a deposit by God. God gave us, some people he deposited 20 years, some 50 years, some 70 years, some 90 years, some 120 years, whatever amount of time God deposited for you, we need to view this and appreciate it as a deposit. So whatever life we were given, death doesn't rob us. Death is only that God is now taking his deposit back. It's not that we feel cheated and robbed by the death as something that was rightfully ours. Our life was never ours to begin with. So it's when you have a loved one who passes away, it's God just taking back his deposit. He gave this person to you for 50, 70, 100 years, but now he's taking it back. In other words, if you think your life belongs to you, then yes, a terrible injustice was done. Something terrible was done, but life never belonged to you. Your body, your soul belongs to God, right? That's why we learn you can't do cremation. By the way, there's a rabbi in Westchester who gave the JLI class number 2 last week, and he has a mother or father. This is a lady. I'm sorry, has a mother or father in Palm Beach Garden, where my brother is a Chabad rabbi in Palm Beach Garden, and this lady called her father and told him, you know, after I learned this class, I don't want you to be cremated anymore. And this person, my brother in Palm Beach, had spoken to many, many times about cremation, and he refused. I'm going to be cremated. But after this class, his daughter was able to convince him not to be cremated, and he signed it last week that he's going to be buried. And he's a very older man, and he actually passed away 2 nights ago. So my brother posted this on the Chabad forum that they were able to give him a Jewish funeral yesterday because of last week's JLI class given in Bedford, Westchester. So that's just by the way. Anyway, so if we feel cheated, it's because we think life belongs to us. But if we train ourselves to realize that life is not ours. By the way, it's with everything. It's with money. It's with possessions. It's with everything. Train yourself that God doesn't owe you. You owe God. Every breath of air that I take is something that God has given me as a gift. So one day God is going to come back and say, I want my deposit back. And the other thing is, there's no such a thing as somebody who passed away before his or her time. This is the second message that Rabbi Elazar told the Rabbi Yochanan. Every person has an exact time to fulfill his or her mission. If a person goes and passes away at the age of 120 years old, everybody will be sad, but everybody will say, wow, this person lived a long life, fulfilling life. But if the age expectancy was 240, then this person died young. If the age expectancy is 120 or 70, 80, and somebody passed away at the age of 20, 30, so we say, oh, he or she died young. But the truth is, they died at the exact time that God wanted them to pass away. They had fulfilled their mission on this earth. So whether it's a car accident or an illness, whatever it is, God has decided in his infinite wisdom to take that deposit back. The person has completed his mission. So these two ideas help us address the frustration and anger caused by the passing of a loved one. Frustration, anger, who was seemingly cut down in the prime of their life, right? This person died so young. These two ideas, life as a deposit and exact time to fulfill the mission, address these two issues. I just want to mention over here, and this is what I wanted to mention about Michael, what you said before in the beginning of the class. So I want to just mention the story told about a middle-aged couple who came to the Baal Shem Tov. And they came and they prayed for a child. They were childless, and the wife exceptionally, she prayed. The Baal Shem Tov says, I can't help you, I can't help you. And the lady's screaming to the Baal Shem Tov, you can help us. If you want us to have a child, we will have a child. So Baal Shem Tov sees the incessant prayers and beseeching of this woman and the man. And he closes his eyes and he says to them, I promise you, within a year, you will give birth to a son. And the wife and the husband, they're like ecstatic. Wow, we have a child. True to his word, within a month or two, the wife became pregnant. And within the year, she gave birth to a child. Their joy knew no bounds. They were so happy. And that's it. The child was raised, a 6 months old, 1 year old. On the child's second birthday, the child died. You can imagine how devastated, how crushed and heartbroken this couple was. They came to the Baal Shem Tov in such pain, intense pain. They said, you blessed us with a child. What do you mean? What happened here? So the Baal Shem Tov said to them, I want to tell you a story. He said, if a few hundred years ago, there was a king living in a certain town, and he was childless. And the local priest came to him and he told him that it's the Jews' fault. If only the Jews would pray for a child for you, you would have a child. It's the Jews' fault. They must have done some voodoo magic. I don't know what. So the king made a decree and he said, if the queen is not blessed with a child within a year, I will leave you will all have to leave the kingdom, and I'm taking all your possessions, which the king was able to do. So the Jews obviously prayed and they prayed and they prayed, and there was a big commotion in heaven. In heaven, they were looking for a soul, for a neshama, for a soul to go and become the child of that king and queen to save the Jews. So there was one very, very lofty soul, a high soul, who said, I will volunteer to enter into the queen and become their child. So the child was born, and the king and queen were ecstatic, and obviously the Jews were saved. No problem. The child was brilliant. The king and queen hired him the best tutors possible in the land. And when the child was 4 or 5 years old, he was so brilliant he needed a private tutor. So they hired him the best priest of the town, and the priest taught this child everything. And the child loved this priest more than his own father. He bonded with him. But there was 2 hours a day, every single day, that the priest was locked up in his own room. And this was a deal he made with the father. I'll teach your son everything I know. I'll be dedicated to him. But 2 hours a day, I want to be my own person. But the child was exquisite. He was curious to know what the priest was doing during those days, those hours. So he hid in the room and he watched the priest do some funny mumbo jumbo stuff. He didn't know what's going on. So in the middle of the 2 hours, he was watching from his hiding place. He comes out and the priest is like, oh my God. And he had caught them with a talis and tefillin. The priest was a secret Jew. And the prince, even though he was such a young child at the time, was able to get out of him that he's a Jew. So he said, I want you to teach me everything about being a Jew. The priest says, I can't do it. If your father finds out, he'll murder me, he'll kill me, he'll hang me. I'm a secret Jew. And the child said, if you don't teach me, I'll tell my father. So the priest taught the child everything about Judaism. Chumash, Mishnah, Halacha, Gemara, everything. And the prince, at a very young age, decided that he wants to convert. So they made this whole plan, this whole beautiful plan. And the priest converted to Judaism. And the priest, the prince converted to Judaism. And to cut a long story short, the prince lived out his life. And when he got to heaven, the greatest levels of heaven were released for this person. I mean, this person was a priest and grew up as a king and a queen and volunteered, his soul volunteered straight to the highest levels of paradise. Says the Baal Shem Tov, when this soul came to heaven, the problem was that there was a stain, there was a blemish on this soul. Because the first 2 years of its life, it fed, it nourished from the queen, ate from her and non-kosher milk, non-kosher whatever. And this was a stain and a blemish upon this pure soul. So in order to reach the highest level, and the highest levels of peace, the soul had to come back down to this world, to be born to a Jewish mother that will nurture him for 2 years. God, when I saw your prayers and how much you wanted a child, figured that you would be the perfect parents to bring that soul, to have that soul and feed him for 2 years. And now he can find his eternal rest in the highest and deepest levels of heaven.
Rabbi, I have a question. So do we have a predefined time on Earth? Is it true to say that we have a fixed number of years that we have to live? And there are 2 mitzvot in the Torah that can extend our life, our days. How do we, these 2 ideas can be understood together?
So first of all, it says in Hayom Yom, it says that a soul comes down into this world for a purpose, for a mission. We all here for a mission, and it could be we live 70, 80, 90, 100 years in this world, only to do one time a favor for a fellow person. So it could be we're out and we pray every day and we go to shul and we listen to the Megillah and we do Pesach and we keep Shabbat and kosher and everything's wonderful. But it could be our mission is one time, one favor for one person. Like, by the way, Mordechai told Esther in the Megillah, when she didn't want to help the Jews, he told her, maybe this is the reason why you were created, to do this one-time favor for your fellow Jews and save them. Now, obviously, that's a big mitzvah. Now, how does that fit in? So yes, we have an allotted time. We have an exact time, which is what Hashem gives us. And once we fulfill that mission, that's it. Life's over. But by the way, how do we know what that mission is? Normally, what's hardest for us to do, that's our mission. But to answer the second part of your question, there's two mitzvot which it says your life will be extended. One is kibud av v'em, and the other one is shiluach hakan, sending the mother bird away. So when you honor your father and mother, it says you will live a long life. So how does that fit in exactly? First of all, we don't know. I don't know. What does it mean you live longer? I don't know. But it must fit in with the allotted time frame that God gave you. So I don't know exactly, in other words, let's say God gave you 50 years or 70 years, and now you fulfill the mitzvah of Kibbut Avayim. So does that mean now you live till 72, till 73? It's not clear from the text. I don't know. Which is, by the way, one of Acher, which is why he became, right, Acher, because he saw a Jewish child honoring his father by doing the second mitzvah, and then he died. So,
he died, yeah. Maybe so, God increases his deposit.
Right, he finished his deposit, exactly. He got back the deposit. So the next part of the problem is, the next issue I'm sorry to address is guilt. So many times we feel guilty. If only I had expressed my love, right? The people on United Flight 92, when they were going to the terrorist attacks on 9/11, what they texted their family back was, it was United 92, I love you, I miss you, I love you, I love you, I love you. When somebody passes away, we feel often very guilty because we weren't able to express our love enough. We weren't able to say I'm sorry enough times. So this is something that you know, how do we deal with this? So the answer to this question is, it's not too late, right? As we learned in this class many times, the soul lives on forever. So if you want to express your love for the soul, if you want to say I'm sorry to the loved one, you can go to the person's grave and just do exactly that. By the way, I have a friend in Yeshiva who passed away at the age of 36 years old. So a young guy passed away at 36 years old. And I have another friend in Yeshiva who made fun of this person. Yeah, I used to make fun of him. Nothing major, like teenagers made fun of him. So, but he felt bad when this person passed away. He felt bad and he felt like he needed to make amends. So he went with a minion to this person's grave in the West Coast, wherever he was buried. And he went there and he said, I beg for your forgiveness. I'm sorry. So this was something that he didn't do when he was alive, but he was able to do when he passed away. No problem. We're able to do it. In other words, death does not terminate the relationship that we have with our loved ones. And this brings us to text number 12. This is a powerful text. It says like this: when children say Kaddish for their parents, it is like sending them regards, right? Some people ask me, why do I have to say Kaddish all day long? But for 11 months, it's like mumbo jumbo. It's a gift that you're sending to the deceased, to the loved one, to your parents. It's like sending them regards. When they learn a chapter of Mishnah on their behalf, it is like sending them a letter. When they fulfill mitzvot and good deeds for the benefit of their souls, it is like sending them an entire parcel. I think I mentioned here once that in the 1970s, there was a person, a motorcycle guy, and I'll just say the story briefly, who came, because we're running out of time, who came to the Rebbe, and he was inconsolable. His child had passed away in a motorcycle accident, and he was literally inconsolable. He didn't know where to put himself. He didn't know what to do. He had no idea. So he came to the Rebbe, and he told him, I've been to every therapist, I've been to every doctor, and nobody can help me. What can I do? So the Rebbe said to him, if I tell you that your son is in a good place, and you can send him gifts, and he will receive the gifts, and he will appreciate the gifts, and he is safe, will you be happy? Will you be okay? The man thought about it. He said, yes. And the Rebbe said, that's exactly what it is. Your son is in a good place. Your son is happy, right? He passed away 6 months ago, but he's happy. He's in a good place. And you can send him gifts, and he will receive them. And every time he receives them, the only thing is he won't send you a message back. That's the only thing. But he will receive them. So every time you learn, you give Zakai in his memory, you light a candle, whatever you do, that is connecting and bonding and giving a gift to your loved one. Okay. Let's just finish off. This is the final part of the lesson tonight. The actual Shiva. So we mentioned over here the basic Shiva protocol. is like this. Okay, so if you look at figure 3.5, it just shows you, this is just the basic laws, which I mentioned some of them. Mirrors and pictures in the Shiva have to remain covered, as I mentioned last week, because the soul is hovering in that room. Right, remain in the house of mourning, continue wearing the garment that was torn as an act of mourning, sit on no chairs or stools, forego the comfort of leather, right? You don't shave, no haircuts, no marital intimacy, you don't study Torah, no work, no business, no music. These are just the baby. You can read them, I'm just reading them briefly. But these are the basic laws, right? No restrictions of bathing, showering, and wearing freshly laundered clothing. That you can consult with a rabbi, because we in 2021 you can't not bathe and shower for 7 days. Dominion, all that. So, what do we do at the mourner's house? What do we say? Text number 13. The sages obligated us to visit the sick and comfort mourners. These are deeds of kindness that one carries out in person and have no limit. Okay, so there's certain mitzvot which have no limit. So let me give you an example of a mitzvah that has a limit. When you look at the mitzvah of charity, for example, so it says you're supposed to give 10% of your earnings to charity, and if you want, you can give 20%. But it says it has a limit, right? You're not supposed to give more than 20%. You made $1,000, you should give $100, which is 10%. But there's a limit. Don't give more than 200, which is 20%. But when it comes to the mitzvah of visiting the sick, of going to a Shiva house, there's no limit, right? I go sometimes every single day to the Shiva house. Why? Because it has no limits. Although these are rabbinic ordinances, they fall under the purview of the biblical commandment to love your fellow as yourself. So what do you do when you come to a Shiva house? Based on everything we've learned, so what am I supposed to be doing? What should I say besides for the verse that we said, Hamakom Yenachem Etchem, obviously. So here we go. Text 14 tells us exactly, you know what you're supposed to do? Exactly what you're supposed to do? Nothing. The reward for visiting the home of mourning is for the silence. You're actually supposed to just be silent. That's it. You're supposed to be silent because nothing you say can comfort the mourner. What are you supposed to say? There's nothing to say. Text number 15, the comforters may not say anything until the mourner opens the conversation. So you go to a Shiva house and you wait for the mourner to, if the mourner wants to give a joke and talk about sports or talk about whatever, that's great. But you don't offer to talk about that thing until the mourner, because every single person grieves differently. And we don't know how they're feeling. So don't try lighten the mood, don't try philosophize. Like a lot of times people will try starting conversation, right? So they'll say, were you there when he or she died? You don't ask questions. I'll read to you a bunch of no-nos, right? Did the person die from cancer or the chemo? You don't ask that question. Did you know in advance or was it sudden? None of your business. Did he have life insurance? Right? As a question that comes up. God only takes the good ones. By the way, this is something that a lot of people say, and they mean well, but it's a wrong thing to say. God only takes the good ones. You want to say that obviously the person who died was a good one. I don't need to hear that. I don't want to hear that. Because every person grieves differently, and you don't know what's going on inside of me. If I say that, then yeah, that's fine. A lot of people make the mistake of stating at least, right, with respect, right, at least this didn't happen, at least the person didn't suffer, respect the pain that is before you without diminishing it. And also don't begin any statement with you need or don't, and don't compare losses, right? Oh, I lost this, I lost that. Don't compare losses, ever. Every person mourns differently. And what you could discuss is obviously the legacy of the deceased, the good deeds of the deceased, personal stories, obviously. Text number 16 tells us, what does God want to hear? The final word regarding a person is that of the people proclaiming his deeds, commenting so-and-so is upright, so-and-so is God-fearing. When a person departs the world, God says to the ministering angels, see what people are saying about him. If they say that he had been upright and God-fearing, his soul immediately ascends to paradise. You see, our words down here below have effects. They actually affect what's going on up there. Like when you shout and scream at somebody, when you tell somebody, oh, I'm going to tear you apart like a fish, that's actually what's happening in heaven. But when you talk good and nicely about people, especially about the deceased, God says to the angels, you see, the person was actually a good person. How do I know that? Because, that's what's happening here. Okay, so 1 second. I have the key points over here. Hold on, I'm going to show you this video of the key points. So we have a summary of what we learned today. So
Lesson 3. The Mourning After. 1. Everyone reacts to and deals with grief differently. No two people are psychologically alike, and no two circumstances of death and bereavement are the same. 2. It is a mitzvah to mourn the loss of a loved one. Processing a loss is critical to the healing process, and this is accomplished by Shiva, a mandatory period of grieving. 3. The Torah validates and encourages mourning, but only for a prescribed period of time, after which the mourner is enjoined to transition back to normal life. 4. Some ideas that give a mourner the strength to move on. A. The knowledge that the soul lives on and is not diminished by death. B. It is never too late to mend or improve our relationship with the deceased. Though our physical relationship has ended, we can still give him or her spiritual gifts. C. Life is a deposit, and God decides when to give it and when it must be returned. D. For this soul and its unique mission, this constituted a full life. 5. It is a mitzvah to comfort mourners. The most basic principle of comforting a mourner is simply being there. Our presence offers comfort and lessens the loneliness that often accompanies mourning.
Okay, so that is, one second, that is, come on. So just to summarize the last few things that we did on this screen, right? So the Kaddish is regards, the Mishnah is a letter, the Mitzvah is a parcel. These are the Shiva traditions, which we went through as well. And visiting somebody who's sick, going to a Shiva is a deed that has no limit, a kindness that has no limit. Again, when you go to a Shiva house, the mourner is the one who opens the conversation. We do not philosophize and don't attempt to lighten the mood. The mourner is the one who has to open the conversation. Right, so discussing the legacy directs grief from passive depression to active mourning. What you should do is discuss acts, good deeds that the person have fulfilled during their lifetime. So that is the end of today's class. If there's any questions, I'll stay on over here. Hope you all enjoyed it. There's 3 more lessons, so 3 more weeks to go, and then we're done. And the 5th one is about reincarnation specifically, which I think somebody asked you today.
It was me. I'll hold off until then, but maybe I just should hold off. I was just going to ask you about the soul that in reincarnation, does it obviously comes back in a different form, but is it the same soul, or is the soul sort of atomized and gets reconstituted in heaven and enters? So the loss of a child, the whole sense of comfort is that the soul sort of lives on infinitely, or is that not correct? The soul metamorphosizes or not?
Right. So we'll go through that in detail. It's actually this quick specific question is there right in the beginning of that class.
Okay.
So we'll do that in 2 weeks' time.
Okay.
All right.
I have a question.
Yes, Ira.
You gave an example earlier of someone going to a gravesite with a minion and to ask for forgiveness from the deceased. Is it possible to ask for forgiveness from a deceased person without going to the gravesite?
The answer to that is yes, but it's much better to go to the gravesite, as we learned last week, that the soul hovers by the grave, a part of the grave, part of the soul, like the nefesh and the ruach. But if in other words, if it's a theoretical question, if it's a practical question, we need to deal with the logistics of that question. But in general, the answer is yes, you could do it with that, but it's better to do it at the grave.
Also, I thought I had learned in another course that we're not supposed to reach out to the deceased.
When you say reach out, there's this story in the Bible about Shaul who reached out to the deceased, to Shmuel, and brought him back from the dead. Literally, in that sense, you're not allowed to. But Judaism is, you could talk to the deceased all the time. You could talk to the person. You could do a mitzvah. Every time you do a mitzvah, it's in their honor, in their memory. Literally every day. Anytime you talk. I remember my father. Every time he spoke about his father who had died, he would say, "My father, alav hashalom, may he rest in peace." That's respecting your father, alav shalom. Just when you're mentioning something about your father, about your grandfather, about, that's respect.
See, I thought I had learned that the way to do it is to ask God to ask on your behalf for forgiveness.
No, you could do it directly.
Oh, okay.
Directly, yeah. Nancy, I see you had a question?
I do. Well, you mentioned something earlier about keeping a flame going for 12 months. I know during the week of Shiva, you have the flame that stays out. And then after that, that's it until the Yortzeit.
Yes. Let me double check on that. I know it said it here in this class that yes, we do that. Let me just double check the prevailed custom and I'll get back to you. But I think we actually do it, yeah. I'll double check that.
So is it wrong to light something now for the remaining time?
No, definitely not wrong. Definitely not wrong. But I'll get back to you with 100% clarity on that.
Thank you.
Rabbi, can we say Kaddish on a grave without a minyan?
No, Kaddish is with a minyan.
Kaddish is with a minyan.
Kaddish is with a minyan. I mean, you could say it in your heart, like whatever, but no, Kaddish is specifically made to be with a minyan.
Okay.
And I know now with COVID it's so difficult, but
yeah. Okay. Thank you.
All right.
Great. But one last thing, to ask for forgiveness, do you need a minyan?
No.
No. Okay.
No.
Thank you.
Myself. All right. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rabbi. Have a good week.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you very much.